Chagiga Daf Chaf takes us to the end of the second parak of the Masechta and introduces the Mishnah of the third parak, the beginning of the third parak of the Masechta. The end of the second parak is discussing the halacha of having in mind that you are guarding an object from becoming tamei. The Gemara will discuss the halacha that you have to know what you're doing, and if you think you're doing something else, you think you're guarding something else, it may not work. Then we'll get to the next parak, which will introduce differences in halacha between truma and karbanos as far as guarding them from tumah. The Mishnah will list 11 cases. So let's begin the daf. We've seen that you have to guard something from tumah, and you also have to guard it for what level of tumah you have in mind. If you plan to guard it for one level of tumah, you did not necessarily for one level of susceptibility for tumah. That is, you did not guard it for a higher level of susceptibility. Now, the Gemara here is going to discuss three cases, which introduce two halachos, about guarding something from tumah, that you have to have in mind that you're guarding the specific object from the specific tumah. The Gemara will teach these two halachos. The Gemara will question both of them and defend both of them. Along the way, we'll have a brisa, which will be difficult to understand and we'll have to explain. So the Gemara begins with three cases, or three halachos. So the Gemara says the first one is mentioned by Rav Yonasan ben Elazar. It says if somebody is holding a handkerchief, and he's guarding it from becoming tamei, but then he drops it. And he says to another person, can you pick it up and hand it to me? So when he hands it to him, it's tamei now. Even if the first person was tar, and the one who picked it up was also tar, the handkerchief is tamei anyway. And the reason is because as soon as you take your mind off something, and you're not guarding it from tumah, it's considered to be tamei automatically. Now, who took their mind off this? So Rashi explains, as soon as he told somebody else to pick it up, he's no longer guarding it because he's not holding it, it's in someone else's hands. As the Gemara will explain later, you can't guard an object from tumah that's being held by somebody else. Now that person is not guarding it either, because he assumes that you don't care about the tumah because you didn't ask him if he was tamei before you told him to pick it up. You just said, hey, pick it up. How did you know that he was tar? Obviously, you didn't care. So that person says, well, you don't care if it's tar, I don't care if it's tar, so I'm not guarding it either. And it comes out for the moment that it was in this person's hand. Even though he was tar, it was unguarded by anybody, each one for his own reason, and therefore it's unguarded, something which is unguarded becomes tamei. Now the core halacha that this case teaches us is that you cannot guard something, or you're not counted as guarding something, if someone else is holding it. The Gemara will question whether or not that's true later in the daf. First we get to the next halacha, which is that you have to know what object you're guarding. If you're guarding an object and you think it's one thing and it's really something else, that doesn't count as guarding and it becomes tamei. So the Gemara gives two examples of that. First one is said by Rav Yonasan ben Amram. He says if you reach for your weekday clothing and you put on your Shabbos clothing, so now you're guarding your clothing that you're wearing from tumah, but you think it's your weekday clothing and really it's your Shabbos clothing, they're tamei because it's the wrong object. Even though you're guarding this object, you think it's something else, that makes it tamei. It's called unguarded. Similar case is mentioned by Rav Elazar bar Tzadok. He says there was an incident that happened that two women went to the bathhouse and they swapped clothing. They put on each other's garment when they came out. So they're each guarding the clothing that they're wearing. However, they think it's their clothing and it's really somebody else's. So he says this case came before Rabbi Akiva and he said they're tamei. Both clothings are tamei even though both women are tahar, because both are considered to be unguarded. So the Gemara is going to question this. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Oishia asks, is it true that if you are guarding an object but you think it's something else, it doesn't count as guarded, and therefore it's considered to be unguarded, and unguarded is tamei? I have a question to that. If you stick your hand into a basket and you think you're pulling out wheat bread, and instead you pull out barley bread, when you look at your hand you say, oh, it's barley bread. So until you looked at your hand, you didn't know what you were holding. You were guarding it from tumah, but you didn't know what it was. So would you say that case is tamei? Now, according to this, it would seem that you would say that it's tamei. The Gemara wants to prove that you can't say that's tamei. The Gemara proves that by bringing yet another case. And that's a brisa, and we're going to have to understand the brisa itself before we can actually learn something from it. The brisa says if somebody's guarding a barrel, and he thinks there's wine in there, and it turns out that there's oil in there, it's tahor. Now, it's tahar. Why is it tahar? This would seem to indicate the other way. This would seem to indicate even though you thought it was a different object, you thought it was wine, it was really oil, the guarding counts and it's still tahar. Now, before we answer the kasha, the Gemara is going to say we have to understand this brisa itself, and it's problematic because it says that it's tahar, but in the next line in the brisa it says you're not allowed to eat it. So if it's tahar, why are you not allowed to eat it? It would seem to indicate that there's something wrong with the kasha here. It's not really tahar. So Gemara says the reason you're not allowed to eat is because the person who was guarding it was only guarding it from something that makes it tamei enough to be metame something else. He wasn't guarding it from something which makes it puzzle. As we've explained in previous daf, everything can be susceptible to tumah up to a certain level, and can pass on up to a certain level. So if something receives tumah from something else, the tumah that it gets, it's weaker. So at some point, depending what level of susceptibility it has, it may be able to get this weak in the tumah, but it cannot pass it further. The tumah that's passed on from it will be too weak to affect something else. That's when an item is called puzzle, but not tameh. It means it's not called tameh because it can't be metame anything else. Anything else that it touches, the tumah will be too weak to make that object problematic. However, this object itself is tameh. So the Gemara is saying this ruling here that the oil is tahar, what it really means is that the oil itself is tameh, but it can't be metame anything else. That's what's called puzzle, but not tameh. That's why you can't eat it. So the Gemara explains it's very simple. The person who was guarding it from a level of tumah strength that is strong enough to make it, this oil or this wine, whatever's in the barrel, to make it be metame something else. He was preventing it from becoming tameh to that level. However, he was not preventing it from becoming puzzle in and of itself. And therefore, he never really did any shmirah, he never did any guarding at all from the level of tumah that makes it itself puzzle and forbidden to drink. That's why you're not allowed to drink it. However, his guarding did work 100%. He was guarding it from being metame something else, from receiving a level of tumah that could be metame something else, and that he has accomplished, even though he didn't know what it was. So the Gemara says, is it possible to do a partial guarding? Is it really correct that you can guard from one level of tumah, but not from a different level of tumah? Can you guard it from something from a level of tumah that it can be passed on, but not from a level of tumah that can't be passed on? So the Gemara says, yes, you can do a partial guarding. Then I'll show you a case. And therefore we go to yet another brisa with yet another case, and that's somebody who was carrying on his shoulder a basket filled with figs, and there was a shovel in the basket, and he stuck his hand into the basket, and he was guarding the basket and the figs, but not the shovel. So the shovel now becomes tameh, because he didn't have in mind to guard the shovel. Now, the Gemara says the basket and the figs are tar. The Gemara wants to know why. If the shovel's tameh, then the shovel should be metame the basket and the figs. So the Gemara says that it didn't be metame the basket, I understand, because the kli cannot be metame another kli. Tumah doesn't go from kli to kli once it's a sheni. Now, which just has to be a sheni. Now, the question though is that it could be metame food, so the shovel should be metame the figs. So it must be, says the Gemara, that he was guarding the shovel from a level of tumah that could be passed on. Therefore, we know that it didn't become tameh enough to be metame the figs. However, he was not guarding it from a level of tumah that it itself is problematic, and therefore the shovel itself is tameh. Now, Rashi explains what's the difference if the shovel's tameh, as long as it can't be passed on. Who cares about the shovel? You're not going to eat the shovel. So Rashi explains how that makes a nafkamina. So anyway, the Gemara says, so we've now established Pradnas Brisa, and now we can go back to our kasha. Right? So our kasha was that is it really true that you have to guard something from the tumah? You have to have knowledge as to what object you're guarding, and if you think it's something else, it counts as hesach hadas, it counts as unguarded, and therefore becomes tameh. It would seem to be not true, because we've seen this case of the oil. So the Gemara says that's one kasha, and now we have another kasha. This kasha is from a lengthy brisa discussing Rabbi Yishmael, who brings more cases. So the Gemara says that there was a lady who came in front of Rabbi Yishmael, and she said, I wove a garment, I was tahar, but I wasn't paying attention to guard it, but I know that it didn't become tameh, no tumah touched it. Is my hesach hadas really a problem? The fact that I wasn't paying attention really a problem? So Rabbi Yishmael questioned her, and he asked her a lot of things about the case, and it came up in questioning that she had actually had a nida helping her out. There was a woman who was a nida who was touching it as she fixed the strings on the rope. So the Gemara says, so she pulled it, and therefore it became tameh, and she didn't even realize. So Rabbi Yishmael said, you see how great are the words of the Chachamim, that they say that if somebody's not guarding something, it becomes tamei. Now, next case, in the same brisa, is another lady who came to Rabbi Shmuel, and she said, I wove a cloth, I was tahar, but I wasn't guarding it. Is it tamei? And again, he questioned her, and it came out that at some point when she was preparing the string snapped, and she held it in her mouth in order to tie it. Says Bishmo, how great is it that the Chachamim said that if you're not guarding something, you have to consider that it's tamei, even though you think nothing happened, because you see this thing became tamei even though she didn't realize it. Now Rashi explains, why does the fact that she tied it in her mouth make a difference? So Rashi explains that as long as it's string, it's not going to be matame anything. It's only matame once it's reached the minimum size of woven of 3 fingers by 3 fingers. So the string being touched is not a problem. However, what actually happened was as follows. The woman was in nida at the time she was setting the string, and she thought it was not going to be a matame because it's not makabel tumah yet. It's not a cloth. However, since she touched it with her mouth, it got her spit on it, and that spit was still on it even after it was woven. And the spit of a nida is a source of tumah, can be matame things, and therefore once it was already woven, now it was 3 fingers by 3 fingers. That spit that's still on it is now matame, and therefore it actually became tahar. So now this all is a kasha because it shows that Rabbi Shmuel said that the only problem here is that the Chachamim said if you're not guarding something, it becomes tamei. He said how great are the words of the Chachamim said if you're not guarding it becomes tamei. He did not say if you're not guarding and you know what you're if you don't know what you're guarding, then it becomes tamei. So you see that with the way Rabbi Shmuel defined the halacha of guarding is that you have to be guarding. You don't have to know what it is. So now we have 2 kashas on the 2 halachas which we said earlier. That you have to know what object you are guarding and what object you're not guarding. So the Gemara answers. So the Gemara says, I'll deal with each of the cases one by one. The case of the ladies who swapped clothing, each one thought the other was the wife of an Am Haaretz, which means she has the halacha of an Am Haaretz, and she doesn't guard a tumah at all, and therefore each one thought, my clothing has become tamei altogether. So she stopped thinking about the tahara, and she stopped guarding altogether. It's not that she was guarding it and she thought it was a different object. She stopped guarding it because she figured the clothing I'm wearing belongs to an Am Haaretz. It's tamei for sure anyway. Even though both turned out to be the wives of Talmidei Chachamim who do guard from tumah, because they stopped guarding it, it became tamei entirely. Now, as far as the case of the Shabbos clothing, there's a different level of shmir that you have for Shabbos clothing than you have for weekday clothing. We guard our Shabbos clothing more, and therefore the fact that he had Shabbos clothing on and he thought it was weekday clothing, he did not keep the same level of shmir that he meant to have all along. Now, the Gemara now goes to the first halacha which we had seen, that you cannot guard an object that's being held by somebody else. So the Gemara explains that the case where the person dropped his handkerchief and someone else picked it up and gave it to him, that the reason that it's not considered guarded by anyone is because the one who's holding it thinks that this guy doesn't care about tumah because didn't ask me if I'm tahar, and the one who's not holding it, he can't guard it because he's not holding it, it's being held by somebody else. Gemara says, is it true that you cannot guard an object that's in somebody else's hand? Gemara says, I have a brisa which seems to say otherwise. Brisa discusses a case of somebody who has workers. He has donkey drivers and workers, and they're carrying barrels of wine. Now, they're not going to be matame the barrels of wine because the barrels are made out of cheres, made out of earthenware, and earthenware does not contract tumah from the outside. The only way they become tamei is if the worker opens it and sticks his hand inside or touches it somehow, then they'll become tamei. So this brisa says as follows. If the owner has made it clear that he's not coming so fast, and these people are not watched, then they have no reason to fear that they'll get caught. You have to be afraid that they're going to be matame what's in the barrels, and therefore they become tamei. If, however, he didn't tell them that he's separating them from a while, even if he went away, but they think he could be coming back at any moment, then they're afraid to touch it, they're afraid to do anything in the barrels, and therefore I could assume that it's tahar. Now, the guarding from tumah here, the Gemara says, seems to be that the fear of the original owner is protecting the things in the barrel that should not be contaminated by the workers. The Gemara says that should be the same as being that you are actually watching an object that's in somebody else's hands, because your fear is supposed to be guarding the object and you're not holding it. Now, Chazner says that's the same halacha, and therefore you could ask Kasha that if you can't guard something being held by somebody else, your fear cannot prevent it from being considered unguarded either. So the Gemara answers, the Gemara says the case here is where the workers are tahar, and there's no problem. So that's why there's no issue. Even if they would open the barrel and stick their hands in, it's not going to be an issue. What is the problem, though? How come it's tamei in the case where the guy went away and told him that he's going away? So they're guarding it. They themselves won't be metamed, but they may meet another am aretz, and they would allow another am aretz to touch it. Therefore, it's susceptible to the tumah from that am aretz. Now, this is already in someone else's hand, because it's not the fear of the owner that's guarding it, it's the workers that are guarding it. Now, if the workers are guarding it, has nothing to do with our case, because it's not talking about where the owner is guarding something in someone else's hand. The workers are guarding this wine. Now, why is there a difference between the cases? So the Gemara says that's very simple. The workers think he's coming any moment, then they will guard the thing and make sure that another amaretz does not come and touch it at all. They don't want to get caught, and therefore their guarding is a good guarding. If they think he's not coming, then they won't get caught. Then they will allow somebody else to touch it, and their guarding is not a good guarding. But there's no case here. The answer to our kasha is that there's no case here of someone guarding something else in someone's hand. This is being guarded by the workers. And the Gemara just spells out that it's got to be that he's coming, that he has the possibility to come from another approach where they won't see him. Because if they know they could just look down the road and see that he's not coming for a while, they won't be afraid. Okay, that concludes the parak. Now we begin the next parak, which discusses the differences between truma and kodesh. Truma, of course, is truma, which has to be kept with a level of kedusha. It's the third level of susceptibility to tumah, which we discussed in our previous mishnah. The level above that is kodesh, which is karbanos. That's carbon and meat, which has to be kept on an even higher level of tumah. So the Gemara, this mishnah, proceeds to show us 11 examples of how there are stricter halachos for karbanos than there are for truma. So the first one is that if you want to be matayar kli to be able to use it for truma or for karbanos, so for truma you're allowed to put one kli inside the other and do the tefillah together. For karbanos, each one has to be done separately. Second halacha, different uses of a kli are considered to be separate kelim as far as truma is concerned, but not as far as karbanos are concerned. So, for example, if you have a kli which is used on the inside, like a cup that you fill with water, and it's also used on the outside, it's used as a rolling pin, for example. The Gemara, the Mishnah discusses a third use, and that would be the handle. The handle could be used for something else entirely. So the word here that's used is beis hatzvita. The Gemara will define in 2 daf what that is exactly, but let's go with handle for now. So these are different uses, and therefore considered a different kli. So if, let's say, the inside of the kli becomes tamei that has not been matami, the outside of the kli, which is a different function, that's a rolling pin, not a cup. Now that's true again for truma, but as far as the halachos of kodesh, any time, any part of the kli that gets touched or gets tamei is entire, all the kli and all its uses. Rashi explains this is only talking about tumah derabanan. Tumah deraisa is matame the entire kli, even in truma. Okay, second halacha, third halacha is if somebody's carrying a medrus, that is, he's carrying something which became tamei from a zava or a nida. So they are matame things by sitting on them. So let's say he is carrying a shoe, Rashi says, by sitting or standing on them. So if he's carrying a shoe of a zav, so he becomes tamei because he's carrying the shoe. So he's allowed to carry a barrel, an earthenware barrel filled with truma. The barrel doesn't contract truma from him because earthenware doesn't get truma from its outside, only from its inside. As long as it's a sealed barrel, it's okay. He's not matami the barrel. However, he cannot hold a barrel that contains karbanos, that contains kodesh. That would be aser. And like all the things in this Mishnah, the Gemara will explain why there's a difference. Now, as far as doing tevilah on a kli, so if you want to do tevilah to use it for truma, you could just put it in the mikvah, and that's all. If it's for karbanos, you have to first make sure that it's untied. If it's cloth, it has to be untied. You can't have any knots, and it has to be dry. And again, the Gemara will explain why the difference applies. Now, when you make a kli, it doesn't become susceptible to tumah at all until it's finished. As long as it's still in the production stages, it's not mekabel tumah. So if somebody was making a kli and he's watching it from tumah throughout the process, when it's finished, it's assumed to be tahar, because until now it wasn't susceptible to tumah, and now he's watching it. That's only true as far as truma goes, but you cannot use it for karbanos. It has to go in the mikvah anyway, as far as karbanos are concerned. Now, if you have a number of different food objects inside a kli, you touch one of them. So, as far as truma is concerned, you're not matame any of the other ones. The next one would be a sheni, the third one would be a shlishi, and so on. If, however, you're talking karbanos, then as soon as you touch one, they're all considered to be one object, and they all become the same level of tumah as the one you touched. So if you were a rishon and it's a sheni, they're all a sheni. If you were a sheni and it's a shlishi, they're all shlishi. Even though one is maybe touching the next one, which is touching the next one, they're all considered to be one thing. Now, another halacha is that in truma, if one hand of a person becomes a tameh, his other hand is tahar. However, as far as karbanos are concerned, if one hand became a tameh, you have to consider both hands to be tameim. Now, if you have dry food, which is not wet, you don't have to worry about it. Tumah, that's if it's truma, but not if it's karbanos. In oneid, somebody who has lost a close relative, he himself did not become tameh, but he's not yet an avel, he needs to go to the mikvah in order to touch karbanos, but not truma. Somebody who was mechusar kippurim, that is, he was a zav or a matzorah or something, that part of the tahara process includes a carbon. So he has to wait a certain amount of time, then he has to go to the mikvah, then he has to wait for the sun to come down, and then the next morning he has to bring a carbon. As long as that carbon hasn't been brought, it's still considered to be a vestige of tumah on him. That level of tumah can be matami karbanos, but not truma. That's a halacha dirabanon. That is a dirabanon obligation for an additional tevilah, not a deraisa, but it applies only to karbanos and not for truma.